Are you ready for this?
Are you ready for this man to be the UK's next Prime Minister? More to the point, is he ready? That was Andy Burnham outlining his plans for government in Manchester, including a new
No10 North.
But what will that look like? What is it? Who'll be in his team? And what would he do in the job? All that and more on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the Newscast studio, just back from Manchester.
And it's Faisal in the Newscast studio.
Chris, you were there at this speech and you've talked about the geographical setting of it. In terms of politics, what message is he trying to get over here beyond what you were just saying a second ago?
So a whole bundle load of policy ideas that we can get into. But firstly, an observation that for me just oozed out of the room when you were standing there at the side, as I always do for these speeches, leaning against a wall. Here was a politician revelling in being on the public stage and revelling in setting out a political vision. And there'll be loads of Labour MPs, whatever their view of the downfall of Keir Starmer or indeed of Andy Burnham, that see a contrast on both of those points with the Prime Minister that Andy Burnham is likely to replace in 3 weeks' time. That here was someone comfortable on the public stage, enjoying it, yes, for its own sake, but enjoying it because it offers a platform for political argument, and then more than comfortable to do the vision thing in terms of his politics and, if you like, his political creed. A couple of years ago, the brilliant authors Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, in their book about the Keir Starmer years, quoted Keir Starmer as saying, "There is no such thing as Starmerism, and there never will be." Keir Starmer wearing that as a badge of pride. His argument was that he was a pragmatist. He would seek what would work. He wasn't defined, if you like, by an ideology or a political creed. Here was Andy Burnham today saying, this is what I'm all about. This is the city region that has shaped me politically since I left Westminster as a cabinet minister, etc., 10 or so years ago. And this is the vision that I want to bring to the UK if I become Prime Minister.
And he calls that Manchesterism, this vision. Before we get into that, though, how did he seem to you, Chris? Nervous, excited? You know, it was a lot of chat about his clothing to begin with.
Yeah.
But, I mean, including that he bought new shorts because his shorts were indecently short, which I thought was indecently too much detail, but whatever.
Right, so that was a reference to a snap taken of him leaving his home during the by-election campaign, where he did a particular sort of 90-degree turn out of the garden gate to run down the road. And as he did that, theatre of the mind and all that, his very short shorts climbed a little bit further north up his thigh, revealing more than he acknowledges now is decent. And so he said that he was presented with two options. One was a change in the decency laws. The other was to buy some new shorts. And he has bought some new shorts. On the wider clothing point, because this has been...
On the wider
clothing point. Because that bit's the sort of, if you like, the daft bit around the shorts. The wider clothing point, I think, is less, if you like, daft or ephemeral, because it is part of his political brand. Back to that point about the jacket in the glass cabinet in the museum. Part of his political brand in his time as as the mayor of Greater Manchester, has been to try and not look like a typical politician. In other words, not wearing a suit and tie the whole time. So what was he wearing today? I think it was a black T-shirt, although he took Kevin Badenoch to task last week saying it was dark blue, his T-shirts. But anyway, wearing a T-shirt with a jacket over the top. Whenever he appears in the House of Commons, of course, because there are rules around these things, he is more formally dressed. But the way he chooses to dress and has chosen to dress in public in the last 10 years is part of, if you like, the brand Burnham.
Fashion aside, what did you make of him? Or fashion included, if you prefer, Faisal.
Well, I mean, I've tracked a bit of the Manchester story. Kind of my own first ever piece was about Manchester regeneration way before Andy Burnham in the 1997, 1998. Right.
Your first piece of reporting.
The report that got my apprenticeship in journalism. Yeah, was
we have a Mancunian in our president.
I know. As we've discussed on Newscast,
was about how after the IRA bomb 30 years ago, like the key insight was that a group of the great and good at the top of the council decided not to rebuild that part of the Arndale Centre, and the regeneration started from there. Now, what does that show you? It shows you that Manchester's been built up as a kind of the city of Manchester at least, as a kind of one-party state where they've been mainly Labour councillors and Labour council, but able to run things to a sort of long-term strategic agenda run by a fairly tight group of people who've been able to ram through a change, catalysed by the RA bomb, catalysed with some public money, but in a way that I think some people don't really get, and it doesn't quite fit in to the sort of left-right spectrum that people like to apply. And I asked him about this directly when I spoke to him about, earlier this year. Like, is it statist? Is it, what is this Manchester way, as he was calling it then, now Manchesterism? And he said it wasn't left or right. And I think that is true in many ways. Yes, it requires some strategy and planning, but it's all private sector kind of construction, building those skyscrapers. It's like sovereign wealth funds from Abu Dhabi, famously, obviously, buying Manchester City and rebuilding a district. So it's quite difficult. Now, how applicable that is to the rest of the country is a very reasonable question. But I think, to sort of circle back to what Chris just said, you look at him, and this is a guy who genuinely believes what he said. He believes it, and he's excited about the subject of devolution, which, let's be honest, if you were to sort of go to a focus group and try and pick the 5 top items, subjects with which to sell your vision of the nation to, I'm not sure devolution would appear in that top 5. But he just kind of went for it.
Well, just quickly, before you chip in, Chris, because this might inform what you're going to say, newscaster Jane in Harrogate has been in touch, who says, devolution seems to be the word of the day with Andy Burnham. What does it mean? How would it work? What other cities will be involved? How much extra will it cost the taxpayer? Many thanks and love the show. Thank you very much indeed, Jane. Feel way more informed, which scares and impresses the neighbours. That's good. Thanks, Jane. I mean, that's interesting. She's right, isn't it? Devolution was the word of the day.
It was the word of the day, and a lot of Jane's questions are absolutely worth asking, and we don't have a lot of the answers to them yet. We have some of the answers, but not a lot of them. Picking up on Faisal's point, what's fascinating is that the central pitch from Andy Burnham in what was his team regard as the sort of foundational text of his approach to governing was about processes. It was about structures of government. Now, I'm not saying for a moment they don't matter. They can absolutely shape outcomes, and people will have views about at what level it is most appropriate to be governed from, because that's the essence of the devolution question. Where should power lie? But in the end, it is a process question, and what will really matter is the outcome it generates. Now, Andy Burnham can make an argument, and there's a separate argument about the extent to which he can take credit for it, or others should, in terms of the transformation of Manchester over the last generation. But in the end, as Prime Minister, as Mayor, or in any other role, it'll be the outcomes that he is in the end held to account for, or can stand on at an election with a record or not behind him.
Well, for what it's worth, the dictionary definition, according to Chambers, of devolution is a handing over of powers or the delegation of certain powers to regional governments by a central government, which I suppose is what we're talking about here. So there we go. But let's just listen to Andy Burnham himself, because he kicked off the main bulk of this speech with what was a pretty stinging diagnosis of how the country has been run in recent years. So let's just have a listen to that.
After 10 years of political turbulence since Brexit and 20 years of falling living standards since the 2008 financial crash, Westminster hasn't been working for people, and it hasn't been working for a very long time. In fact, it is broken. And as a result, the country isn't where it should be. It is stuck in a rut, and clearly we can't go on like this. My generation of politicians, including me, must take responsibility. We haven't been good enough. But instead of being honest about that, the parties have continued with politics as usual, finger-pointing, point-scoring. Now, that might matter less in a world where people's lives are getting better, but when they are not, it is dangerous and destructive of what remains of public trust in politics. We cannot go through another decade like the one we have just had.
What do you make, either of you, of that as a piece of analysis of where we are?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is we've heard of Broken Britain before, haven't we? And there's been many debates about that. But he's saying something slightly different. He's saying Westminster is broken.
And Whitehall.
And Whitehall
The point
is
being,
broken.
to maybe, I mean, lots of newscasters will get that distinction, but Westminster being, broadly speaking, the politicians, and Whitehall, broadly speaking, being the civil servants. Is that roughly fair?
Yeah, and so to go beyond the process, these sorts of more devolved decision making in regions is very normal across Europe, and that is why when people lucky enough to go on holiday to places like Barcelona or Bilbao or any German city that's not Berlin, it is normal to see a metro system, an integrated transport system, sort of slightly more functional public services that seem like they're planned. If the population goes up, they plan school places to go up a little bit more, and just sort of things that I think that is what he's talking about, and to turn all that around quickly is quite something. Is devolution the only reason, or is there also an issue about funding of public services there that he didn't address at this point? There are many issues to go into that, but I think the idea that he is defining what the problem is, both economically but also politically, so that he can fill the space of what the solutions are and what we talk about. Do you see what I mean? Like, Keir Starmer didn't do that. And frankly, I discussed, did Nigel Farage decide what political space was and what time was spent, what problems were to be addressed? He's sort of getting in there and saying, no, this is the problem, and I'm going to spend all my time talking about it. And by the way, so are you.
And that comparison with Germany in particular, Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, who's the Labour mayor of the Liverpool City region, wrote a book together a couple of years ago, fleshing out this diagnosis. Two former Labour MPs who left Westminster, said they were fed up with Westminster, went on to run their home city regions, and then wrote a book, and which lots of us have been re-devouring in the last couple of weeks. And one of the chapters gets right into the German model, and I might be putting the umlaut and therefore the pronunciation in the wrong place here, but the Landers, or the regions of Germany, set out constitutionally, as Faisal was fleshing out, to have mechanisms that ensure there isn't a concentration of power only in the capital, only in particular metropolitan centres. And they talk proudly about inviting a German regional politician to a convention of the North that they set up a couple of years ago to hear that argument out. But that's the vision. To get from where we are now, just in terms of the piping, the plumbing of the UK constitutional settlement, or in this instance, the English.
Well, I was going to say that.
The English constitutional settlement is one heck of a journey when you're 3 years out maximum, from Andy Burnham's perspective, if he becomes Prime Minister, from a general election. I
mean, from my perspective, living in Scotland, I have to say, we've had quite significant devolution in these islands since 1999 in terms of the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senate, and in a slightly separate process, obviously, but the Northern Ireland Assembly at Stormont. So we'll maybe come on to that.
Yeah,
and
we could unpick a bit of that.
The two things intersect. But before that, just sticking with England, and this isn't just about England, but perhaps the most significant thing that Andy Burnham today announced in terms of process, and to be fair, there were a sprinkling of policy as well, which we'll also come on to, but maybe the most significant process thing was this idea of a new number 10 in the North. Let's listen to him describe that.
The job of number 10 North will be to make power flow into the Midlands, into the southwest, into the east of England, and yes, into London, as I said before, as much as into the northeast, Yorkshire and the Humber, and here in the northwest. It will be about offering new opportunities to extend devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland by taking power deeper down. The people of Dundee and Bangor feel just as distant from Holyrood and the Senedd as they do from Westminster. Now get this. Number 10 North will be the nerve centre of a rewired Britain.
Not to pick on all the Scottish aspects, but I'm not sure that it is entirely fair to say that the people of Dundee as a whole feel closer or further away from, as far away from Holyrood as they do from Westminster. But leaving that to one side, I think you find quite a lot of people in Dundee, which is a pro-independence, city that voted for Scottish independence, a pretty staunch Scottish National Party city in part anyway. I'm not sure that's true, to be honest, that people there feel as distant from Holyrood as they do from Westminster. I'm not saying people don't think there are problems with Holyrood or problems with public services in Scotland. And actually, that's an interesting question in the context of devolution is the solution, because if it were the solution, then Scotland should be the land of happiness and milk and honey. And there's definitely issues in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland as well as there are in England.
I was struck today listening to the argument and observing who was in the audience. So the audience was chocker with Labour mayors, directly elected mayors from English cities and regions, that whilst Andy Burnham did talk about Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, much of his devolved argument was looked at through an English prism. I don't think we should be that surprised by that. The guy's been a mayor of an English city region for the best part of the last decade. Incidentally, trivial point, but I'll mention it anyway. It was brought to my attention today, just about this number 10 North idea, that there is a Downing Street industrial estate in Manchester. There are only, though, 8 units on it. So there's no number 9 and there's no number 10.
That's funny. Chris, do you know anything more about what this means, number 10 North, and how it would work? And would the Prime Minister be based there some or all of the time? Do we have any detail?
We're getting a bit of a sense of it. So on the one hand, it is not unique for a British government to have offices that are not in London. There are aspects of the civil service scattered all around the UK. And the last government set up a Treasury campus in Darlington in the northeast of England, not a million miles away from Rishi Sunak's seat in Parliament in Richmond and Northallerton. I think the difference with Andy Burnham's idea is that it would be pointedly more political. So we hear that he may have a deputy chief of staff who is based in that number 10 North, and that the mission of the number 10 North would be specifically around the devolution agenda. Now, a cynic might say you've got your chief of staff in London and your deputy chief of staff in Manchester, so you can sort of, but then ultimately, of course, London is the seat of power of the government. It is where the Prime Minister spends a huge amount of their time. So that seems to be an element of how the wiring of Andy Burnham's vision for government would be. And then we can get on to some of the policy ideas that he hopes that office could turn around.
But this is where the detail really matters, right? Like when you look at the international comparisons here, regions, states in America use the tax system to attract business, attract employment, attract jobs. Is this about spending? Is it about borrowing? This is another key area. If a certain locality, a city, region is fast growing, its population is growing, and this is an example, I think. This is a classic example. In Manchester, the city of Manchester, its population was 500 in the 1980s, living in the central wards of Manchester.
I beg your pardon, Faisal, that's amazing.
Yeah, well, it was completely depopulated, so they've repopulated.
And what's the figure now?
It's up to about, it's over 100,000, on course to 250,000, because there's so many. So just think about that for a minute. Just think about what Manchesterism is. In Manchester, they're boasting about repopulating, increasing the population of Manchester because of why? It brings a tax base, it's growth. Now, just let's dial back again to the sorts of conversations we have at the Westminster level about population, about migration, about should it go up, should it be the same? It's quite a different perspective on all of this. So what are regions around the world that manage to compete? If you have this population growth, you want a decent transport system to accommodate that. It's creaking at the seams. So you would borrow money based on the fact that your population is growing, full of nice graduate jobs, serving universities that are in your cities. And they're trying to keep graduates in these cities, this is the point. But you want to invest in a significant transport system. You borrow money, okay? Now, is he going to allow all these city regions to borrow money? That's ultimately devolution. But hang on a minute. You just said you're keeping to the fiscal rules. You're going to have strict controls on borrowing. But you're going to allow what? All the Labour councils? What about the Reform councils? Are they going to allowed to go and borrow 10 billion for a new tram system or something?
And this is where the detail is so key. But then also how devolution feels, because one of the criticisms or the critiques that you hear of the current devolved model, either at an English regional level or at a national nations level within the UK, is that the current formula creates a temptation for grievance, so that those outside of Westminster, all too often, their easiest political crutch, if you like, is to blame Westminster. Now, the argument goes that that is much easier to do, and arguably a much more, in general terms, a much more plausible argument to make when Westminster continues to hoard a lot of power, whether that be around money or taxes or the capacity to borrow, whatever it might be. So how far and where and on what timescale is Andy Burnham willing to deliver on this vision if it's going to get anywhere near as close as some of the examples, whether it's Germany or individual states in the US or whatever it might be, that he and others talk about when they talk about what they would see as a proper devolution?
And there was something niche which I really want to ask Chris about, which was this idea. Does he really mean that he doesn't, the whipping system of MPs?
Well,
go for your life, guys. You can rebel. Did he really mean?
Didn't quite say he would get rid of it. He said that he would stop being mean with it.
Yeah, so this is another big theme that he explores in this book with Steve Rotherham, and he's talked about a lot since he left Westminster, is that he grew to really dislike what Westminster calls the whipping system. In other words, the discipline mechanism that exists to try to ensure that a collection of MPs of the same political party all vote in the way that the leadership want them to vote. And he argues in the book, I was rereading this on the train on the way to the speech this morning, that he thinks the whole whipping system is completely ridiculous and should be pretty much abandoned. They're my words, not his, but that's the broad sentiment. And I thought, well, he could be Prime Minister in 3 weeks' time. I mean,
a somewhat different approach.
Maybe there might be some evolution going on with that argument. Now, and I thought, will he even mention it? Now, he did, to be fair, mention it. Now, I think where he hasn't a ladder that he can climb down to a process where, I mean, look, I will be flabbergasted, to put it gently, if when we hear about Andy Burnham's cabinet in a few weeks' time, if it happens in a few weeks' time, granted the appointment of a chief whip will not be the most eye-catching, but it would be very eye-catching if there wasn't one. There will be one. Now, the argument he was making today, which he is helped by some decision-making from Keir Starmer, is that he would apply it, he says, sort of less vigorously or in a way that isn't seen to be, as a critic might see it, vindictive. So Keir Starmer from very early on, despite their vast majority, was willing to use the Westminster language, suspend the whip, remove the whip from Labour MPs who were basically disobedient. I think you might see an approach from from Andy Burnham, to get used to that sentence formulation, where perhaps he's a little bit more relaxed about rebellion up to a point. But I've never come across any Prime Minister who is utterly relaxed about rebellions when they get rather big.
No, I could imagine. Now, what about policy? We've talked about process. We've talked a bit about devolution. There was some policy in this speech. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I've missed one of them, the main ones. A promise to cut business rates
in England.
To build new council houses
in England,
not social houses or affordable houses, but council houses, which rather implies continuing to be owned by the state after they've been built and presumably funded by the state in terms of the building.
And therefore, with all sorts of questions back to Faisal's point around financially how that works.
Exactly. And he talks about potholes and fixing potholes. I mean, the thing, actually, on your point, Faisal, the thing that struck me listening to that was that, well, these things aren't just, at least it strikes me that they don't seem to just be about administration and about power, but also about money. Yeah. Potholes being a case in point. It is the failure to fix potholes at the moment a result of the councils not having the power to fix potholes? Yeah. Well, presumably not. It's presumably the councils feel they don't have enough money to fix the potholes. Where does the money come from if you're going to stick to the existing borrowing rules and tread very carefully in those terms? I mean, maybe his argument is, well, the devolution of power in and of itself generates growth, but don't you need to fix the potholes before the businesses want to drive their trucks down the road that generates the growth? You know, I'm not entirely sure how it works.
But I think he's clearly identified and believes that there is a mass constituency in this country to sort, if you like, rebuild Britain and to get capital spending pumping far harder than it has been and to speed that up. And that will then manifest itself in fixed potholes and council homes. There's something they've pioneered actually in Greater Manchester in terms of the accounting for how councils can do this, that they want to spread everywhere. But I think the broader point is, all of this sounds like it's going to cost money, and if you're sticking to the borrowing rules, which he is, if you're sticking to the pledge of the 2024 manifesto not to increase the major taxes, you fundamentally do not have the same constraints. Therefore, does more capital spending on, I don't know, like the Liverpool to Manchester high-speed train line necessarily mean less spending elsewhere? Or can you tweak something within the rules to spend more on capital? Hang on, what about the defence spending? We'll hear about tomorrow. So I think this is a delicate balancing act. By the way, his advisors are quietly, and they may just be speaking too soon here, but it seems to have gone quite well so far. Reassuring over the fiscal rules seems to have yielded almost like complete calm in the markets, which I think, given absolute upheaval that Chris has been reporting on every night, would be seen as a relatively okay result. So we await the name of the Chancellor, but and we're going to be waiting, sounds like, till the 15th or 16th
Indeed.
of July.
Well, on that, there was a mention, wasn't there, of he said, I'm not going to be naming any names for his top team. You know where this is going, don't you?
Have an inkling as to
naming any names for his top team.
James might be heading in the direction.
And he had a jab at the Westminster press pack. And he mentioned you by name.
He did.
That was playful.
Formally. Mr.
He did. So I'm blushing a bit here. So I think there's two reasons for this. One is because obviously my job comes with a certain kind of profile. Secondly, because I have this habit of leaning against the wall during speeches rather than sitting down. I rather stood out, and I caught his eye as he was saying it.
And he said, "Good morning, Mr. Mason."
He did say good morning, to which I nodded a good morning back. Two things. So a couple of points to make about that little moment. One is, and again, don't underestimate how much this matters, Keir Starmer would never do that. He would just never do that. There was Andy Burnham just ad-libbing in the moment on the stage to make a point. Gentle Josh at a journalist, and that's what it was meant as, and and that's fine. And again, just that being comfortable on the stage. I would say in my defence that I forget the exact phrase that he used to describe some of the reporting. Hopeless speculation or wild speculation. I would say that what we have reported about who may or may not feature in his cabinet is well sourced. It's fluid because they're still making their minds up, but it isn't wild speculation where we speak when we are reporting, we're doing so because we are comfortable with the veracity of what we're being told.
I also thought that your defence was that the time at which this was supposed to have been happening, you had lost your voice anyway.
Well, yes,
so it couldn't have been you. There were no questions.
There were no questions.
I presume you'd gone to Manchester. Lots of other journalists had gone to Manchester. There are lots of very legitimate questions that we've been talking about from Mr. Burnham.
In their defence, they didn't mislead us because they told us before we set off that there wouldn't be any questions. So in that sense, we weren't invited under a false prospectus. But it is worth saying it's two things. This is the second time now where, in the last 10 days, where he's been in front of reporters and has avoided questions. So the Friday after he'd won the by-election the night before, he kind of literally ran away from our questions on the hallowed turf of Ashton Football Club. And then today he didn't. Now, look, if you're one of his strategists and you are trying to do a big vision thing about what you want to say to the country, the argument for not taking questions is if you had taken questions, I'd have asked him and Beth Rigby from Sky and various others, is Ed Miliband going to be your Chancellor? How are you going to get on with Donald Trump? What about the Defence Investment Plan? And that would have become part of the story as opposed to it being about his pitch. The counter is, here is a Prime Minister, if he gets the job very shortly, which looks highly likely, who arrives mid-Parliament, who has faced not the scrutiny of a leadership race, if there isn't a leadership race, which looks likely, and
a debate.
Exactly.
When this happened with the Conservatives, we were sat chucking various questions at Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. None of that is happening.
Yeah, they went through a summer of scrutiny, both of them, and then they ended up both having a go at the job. And Andy Burnham is not likely to get any of that because if he doesn't face a rival, it's all going to happen very quickly. So at what point does the scrutiny come? They insist, his team, I should say, that he will face scrutiny. He'll be put in front of journalists in the next couple of weeks, etc., etc.
But in terms of the econ of this is where the Venn diagram crosses over quite interestingly, and I just wonder if the Labour Party has actually decided that this is precisely what it doesn't want. That it wants almost to pass, the mandate, intact. Is it the Ming Vase? I don't know what it is. Like,
No.
just directly over to Andy Burnham without the hostages to fortune. You get serious hostages to fortune in a situation like this. David Cameron on Brexit, the promises he had to make to become.
Oh right, yes.
So star in when he wins that leadership campaign back in whenever it was.
Yeah.
So and then but there are serious questions we'd like to ask him that I think, say, the Labour members would be interested in. So, for example, the Makerfield test. Okay, so what one constituency has a veto on, let's say, where Brexit goes, where the Brexit reset goes. The Cabinet was starting to say that we're going to have another look at the red lines for the next manifesto. Now,
on taxation.
Oh no, for the red lines on
the EU member on relations with the EU.
On relations to the
Beg your
EU.
pardon.
So
Yeah.
that raises at least the prospect of a conversation about some greater involvement with the single market. Now, does that survive a Makerfield test? Would the Labour members actually think, well, hang on, I don't want to make a field test on that one, because actually Labour membership probably are quite, to coin a phrase, single marketing. On welfare, which is another area where with the fiscal rules, he leaned into that very purposefully, I think, to say I can be tough on things like spending. And he did it by saying I will accept, endorsing the Milburn process, which may come up with some quite tough stuff on welfare spending. So that is quite an interesting one to watch. We'd like to know if he would...
Yeah.
Would he endorse whatever Milburn comes up with? Universal credit being cut and the like. Those are my two. You've got probably 102 more.
And I can't resist for newscasters and the Brexit caster aficionados amongst them to just flesh out that example you gave from 20 years ago, because of a leadership race within a party where a promise made on the stump against an internal rival had real consequences, which you hinted at. Yeah. So David Cameron running against David Davis broadly to his right and more Eurosceptic. David Cameron promised to take the Conservative Party out of the centre-right grouping in the European Parliament, the EPP, the European People's Party, and then did that as leader. And, that was in the forerunning discussions and debates within the Conservative Party and beyond around the whole question of our place in the European Union. And that came about in the cut and thrust of internal competition within a party for a leadership position. Now, I'm not saying whether a leadership race is better or not than not having one, but they do have consequences. And on that point about the sort of handing on of the Ming vase, so far at least, and as I say, he does say, Mr. Burnham, who will subject himself to plenty of scrutiny in the coming weeks, but there's a finite amount of how much of that there will be given the time frame that we're looking at. And so, yeah, that will mean perhaps that he gets through the door of Downing Street clinging on to that vase perhaps intact or more parts of it or whatever.
Well,
but
he's doing kick-ups with it. I mean, because he hasn't had to... The point being, he's trying to get through it without having any of these questions.
Completely.
So he gets a sort of clean... This seems to be why I think the markets are calmer than you might think, because they think, well, he said, listen, I'm fiscally prudent. Now, believe that or not, let's see where the Chancellor decision goes. But he's also appears to... There seems to be a prospect now, maximal probability, that he gets through the doors of Downing Street without having to make too many promises.
One of his,
which is interesting.
Someone very close to him said to me over the weekend that the thing is, this person said to me, because of where he's come from, in other words, not being in Parliament prior to 10 days ago, is that he's not beholden to anyone. Now, what they meant by that was the wider party rather than the markets or the wider country. But you take that thought one step on to exactly what we've just been kicking around, and that capacity to try and arrive in office relatively cleanly. Now, the flip side to that is if you leave lots of those unanswered questions, and Rishi Sunak had a bit of this, because even though he went through a leadership race, it was widely assumed rightly all the way through it that he would be the loser, and so there was more attention paid to his rival. But he was still on umpteen public stages in front of cameras, taking umpteen questions principally from Conservative Party members. And, that's not happening with Andy Burnham.
Chris, thank you very much.
Cheers, James.
Faisal, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's it from us. Bye-bye.